On the morning of February 24, 2022, Vladimir Putin announced what he called a special military operation, a phrase sanitized enough to conceal the ambition behind it. The plan, as reconstructed by Western intelligence agencies and confirmed by the speed of the initial assault, was breathtaking in its arrogance. Kiev would fall within 72 hours. Ukraine's government would collapse. A puppet administration would be installed, and NATO, confronted with a fait accompli, would do nothing. It was a gamble dressed up as a military operation, and it failed before the week was out. What followed was not a corrected strategy. It was a doubling down. And that distinction between a nation that recalibrates and one that accelerates toward its own ruin is the key to understanding why. 4 years into this war, Russia has already lost, not just on the battlefield, but in every dimension that defines strategic victory. To understand the scale of the miscalculation, you have to go back to what Putin actually wanted. This was never purely about territory. The annexation of Crimea in 2014 had been relatively painless. A swift operation, international condemnation absorbed, sanctions absorbed, life continuing. Putin had learned the wrong lesson from that episode. He believed the West was decadent, divided, and ultimately indifferent to Ukraine's fate. He believed his army was a modern force capable of rapid conventional warfare. He believed the Ukrainian people would accept or even welcome his arrival. Every single one of those assumptions was wrong. And when reality collided with the plan, the consequences were irreversible. The numbers that define this war are staggering, and they tell a story that Russian state media cannot contain. By late February 2026, according to estimates shared with Russia, matters by a highly informed former senior Western official, Russian military casualties, killed and wounded combined, had reached approximately 1 million. 1 million. A figure not seen in European warfare since the Second World War. Former CIA Director William Burns, in a January 2026 interview with the Financial Times, put the figure at 1.1 million Russian casualties. Against that, the Center for Strategic and International Studies estimated up to 325,000 Russians may have been killed outright. Ukraine has suffered grievously too. Estimates range from 500,000 to 600,000 total casualties. But the asymmetry in what each side can absorb demographically, economically, and strategically is the central fact of this conflict. Russia is bleeding at a rate its population and economy cannot indefinitely sustain. Consider the territorial mathematics. Russia has, at enormous cost, captured roughly 20% of Ukraine, an area approximately the size of the U.S. state of Pennsylvania. Since the full-scale invasion began, Russia's average monthly territorial gain through 2025 was 171 square miles. That sounds significant until you place it beside the cost. In 2025 alone, Russia lost nearly 24,000 tanks and armored vehicles, 361 aircraft, and a staggering volume of precision munitions that cannot easily be replaced under Western sanctions. The Institute for the Study of Wars analysis shows that between October 2025 and March 2026, Russia's average daily territorial gain had actually slowed from 5.7 square miles per day to 4.1 square miles per day, a deceleration even as Moscow claimed momentum. Towns like Pokrovsk, Mirnorod, and Huliaipol fell in early 2026 after months of grinding, costly assault. These are not the advances of a military winning a war. They are the advances of a military consuming itself to move a line. But the battlefield is only one theater of this conflict. The economic dimension is where the story becomes truly dark for Moscow and where the verdict of history is being written in real time. When sanctions were first announced in February 2022, Russian officials dismissed them. They were right that the immediate collapse predicted by some Western analysts did not materialize. Russia redirected its oil through India and Turkey, found alternative supply chains, and ramped up defense production in a wartime spending surge that temporarily inflated GDP. But that sugar rush is over. By 2025, Russian GDP growth had collapsed to around 1%, down from more than 4% in the wartime boom years of 2023 and 2024. The International Monetary Fund projects the same anemic figure for 2026. The Russian economy, in the assessment of the Bank of Finland, has hit the ceiling imposed by war. It cannot grow further. It can only sustain. The oil sector tells the sharpest part of the story. Russian oil revenue, historically the lifeblood of the Kremlin's budget, has been systematically dismantled. Sanctions have forced Russia to sell its flagship Urals crude at a discount of up to $29 per barrel, below the global benchmark Brent crude price. By early 2026, Urals was trading below $40 a barrel, a price that, when factoring in Russia's production costs of $39 to $45 per barrel, meant roughly half of Russia's oil companies were operating at a loss. Rosneft, Russia's largest oil company, reported a 70% drop in profits in 2025. Lukoil was appealing to the state for tax relief, and Ukrainian drone strikes had forced an estimated 40% of Russia's oil refining capacity offline, with exports from all three of Russia's major Western oil export ports disrupted. In 2025, Russian oil revenues fell by 24% to $111 billion, a catastrophic shortfall that the Kremlin has attempted to paper over by raising VAT from 20 to 22%, cutting services and depleting reserves that were already dangerously low. The reserve problem deserves a moment of particular attention because it exposes the structural fragility beneath Russia's projected confidence. At the start of the war in 2022, Russia held approximately $610 billion in foreign exchange reserves. Due to Western sanctions, including the freezing of roughly $300 billion by European nations, Russia's available liquid hard currency reserves had fallen to just $86 billion by the start of 2025. That is a reduction of more than 85% in accessible reserves. Meanwhile, defense and national security spending now consumes approximately 38 to 40% of Russia's entire federal budget, a proportion, as Carnegie Endowment analysts noted, not seen since the Soviet Union's Cold War era. And unlike the Soviet Union, Russia does not have the population, the ideology, or the institutional depth to sustain that kind of military fiscal commitment indefinitely. The Soviet Union collapsed under a far less severe version of these pressures. Defense spending at 7 to 8% of GDP, a figure Defense Minister Belousov himself confirmed for 2025, is not a sign of strength, it is a sign of desperation. Normal, stable economies spend 2 to 3% of GDP on defense. When a country is devoting nearly a tenth of its entire economic output to military expenditure while simultaneously facing labor shortages, capital flight, and declining oil revenues, it is not winning. It is mortgaging its future. Russia's labor ministry warned Putin that the economy would need 10.9 million additional workers by 2030. An estimated 500,000 to 750,000 Russian men, skewing young, educated, and concentrated in the tech sector, have fled the country since 2022 to avoid military service. Male life expectancy has fallen. A generation of human capital is gone, and it will not return. Then there is the human cost that bleeds into Russian society in ways the Kremlin struggles to control. Putin built this war on a promise of insulation. The idea that the special military operation would remain distant from the lives of Russians in Moscow and St. Petersburg. That promise has collapsed. Ukraine's long-range drone campaign has struck refineries in Samara, chemical plants in Stavropol, oil depots in Crimea, and military installations deep inside Russia's own territory. By early 2026, Russian border regions like Belgorod Oblast were experiencing multi-week power outages and disruptions to heating. Around 100,000 customers in Belgorod were without running water on a single day in February 2026 after Ukrainian strikes knocked out pumping stations. The war has come home. And when it did, the social contract Putin constructed, war out there, stability in here, began to fray in ways that are difficult to reverse. The consequences of that fraying are already visible in Russia's domestic fabric. Transparency International's 2025 Corruption Perceptions Index ranked Russia 157th out of 182 countries, its worst result in the history of the poll, down 3 positions from the year before. Crime has risen significantly. Corruption has deepened. Multiple senior Russian officials, from regional governors to national figures in the defense establishment, have been arrested on corruption charges even as the war continues. The military-industrial complex, now consuming vast public subsidy, has created an entrenched constituency of war that will resist any peace settlement that threatens its funding. Putin has not simply started a war. He has restructured Russian society around a war, and restructuring society around war is extraordinarily difficult to undo without a crisis of political legitimacy. And the geopolitical transformation that this war has triggered may be the most lasting and damaging consequence for Russia's long-term strategic position. Before February 2022, NATO was arguably in its weakest political moment since the end of the Cold War. France had called it brain dead. The United States under Donald Trump had questioned Article 5. Expansion was stalled. Within months of the invasion, Finland and Sweden, two of the most militarily capable and geopolitically significant nations in Northern Europe, applied for and received NATO membership. Finland alone extended NATO's border with Russia by over 1,300 kilometers. A military alliance that Putin wanted to weaken is now longer, stronger, more unified, and more heavily armed than at any point since 1991. European defense budgets are expanding rapidly, with NATO members committing to 5% of GDP in defense spending. The continent has mobilized in a way that will persist long after any ceasefire. Ukraine itself has undergone a transformation that is perhaps the most consequential of all for Russia's strategic calculation. The country that Putin expected to capitulate has instead forged a national identity in the crucible of resistance. Ukrainian drone technology, developed domestically under conditions of active warfare, has evolved from improvised weapons into sophisticated systems capable of striking oil refineries finally 500 kilometers inside Russian territory. The Ukrainian military that existed in 2022 was a conventional post-Soviet force. What it has become through 4 years of NATO intelligence sharing, Western equipment, and combat experience is something categorically different. Whatever territorial lines a future peace settlement draws, Russia will face on its western border a combat-hardened, Western-integrated Ukrainian military far more formidable than the one it invaded. That is a strategic failure of historic magnitude. The question that hangs over all of this is whether these losses add up to what we normally call defeat. The front line, after all, still exists inside Ukrainian territory. Russia controls roughly 20% of the country. Cities have fallen. People have suffered immensely. So in what sense has Putin lost? The answer lies in what his objectives actually were. He did not invade Ukraine to capture 20% of it at the cost of 1 million casualties, an economic trajectory towards stagnation, the enlargement of the alliance he sought to weaken, the radicalization of the country he sought to subjugate, and the restructuring of his own society around a military economy it cannot sustain. He invaded to win quickly, decisively, and cheaply, to redraw the map of Europe on his terms before anyone could respond. That did not happen, and the cumulative damage since that failure has been building with a compounding logic that no amount of tactical battlefield progress can reverse. What the experts increasingly argue, from the Rand Corporation to the Carnegie Endowment to the Bank of Finland, is that Russia's trajectory is structural, not cyclical. The labor is gone. The reserves are depleted. The oil sector is under siege. The defense budget crowds out everything else. The political system engineered for Putin's perpetuation cannot process the information it needs to correct course. The Kremlin has stopped publishing critical economic data, including figures on foreign trade and the financial health of major banks, not just to hide the truth from outsiders, but, as Carnegie analysts note, because the bureaucratic system has become so distorted by the fabricated narrative that officials themselves no longer have access to accurate information. A government flying blind at war, burning through 1 million casualties, and spending 40% of its budget on weapons. That is not a government that is winning. That is a government in managed decline, executing a strategy that has no destination other than exhaustion. History does not always announce its verdicts loudly. Sometimes it writes them in ledger entries, in oil revenue figures and labor ministry warnings, in drone strikes on chemical plants and corruption rankings, in the slow, grinding arithmetic of territorial gains that cost more than they are worth. Vladimir Putin gambled everything on a war he expected to last 3 days. 4 years later, 1 million Russian soldiers have been killed or wounded. The country he sought to erase from the map has been tempered into something harder and more Western than it has ever been, and the alliance he wanted to destroy has never been more powerful. The war may not be over. The suffering on all sides continues, and continues to be immense. But the question of who has already lost, in the strategic, historical, and irreversible sense, is one that analysts from across the political spectrum are increasingly willing to answer the same way. Putin did not just fail to win. He engineered, at staggering human cost, the precise outcome he set out to prevent.